I handed the papers to Joe, who took them and carefully shuffled them into his briefcase, clasping it shut and putting it back down onto the floor next to my bed. Wow, that was a strong send off to that letter. What do you think? He asked, turning to face me. I didn't respond for a moment, just trying to take it all in. It was a lot to unpack. Finally, I spoke, being careful with my choice of words. Well, for one thing, we have no actual solid connection between this memo and the things that attacked us. They could be completely unrelated, for all we know. Joe nodded, but didn't seem convinced. Perhaps you're right, but it seems like a bit too many coincidences, doesn't it? The woman, Ruth, she was collecting information on our boss. She didn't know what he was doing, but it was clear that it was not very good. Then, she goes missing. And it just so happens that the day I go to investigate, there are two people there that clearly don't want me messing around with her stuff, and attempt to feed me to that thing in the basement. A thing, I might add, that bears more than a passing resemblance to the other thing that broke into your basement and attempted to eat your cat, and then you. I nodded. A fair point. There are a lot of coincidences, even if we have nothing concrete connecting them. This Project G, and the organization that surrounds it, could be completely unrelated to everything and has been simply caught up with all of this by being at the wrong place at the wrong time. Do you really believe that? Joe asked me, and I sighed. No, not really. It seems pretty clear cut that whatever this is, it has something to do with that memo you just put in your briefcase. But I want to make sure we acknowledge every possibility. A fair point. But considering that we have little more to go on, I say we follow this lead and see where it takes us. We can't go back to the woman's shelter. It's nothing more than a burnt out shell now. And I doubt going back to the woods would help us, even if we wanted to. I thought of those woods. The dark trees that were not trees and the trails of slime. The sloshing of the flesh as it moved in its strange, uncanny ways. No, I did not want to go back to the woods, and I shook my head to show my thoughts on that particular endeavor. Perhaps we should just contact the police, tell them what we know, let them take over for us. It's not like we're at our best right now anyway. Even as I said it, I could hear the lack of conviction in my own voice, which Joe obviously picked up on. You know they would never believe us. Giant meat things attacking us in the night? Some sort of shady organization behind it all? Perhaps if we had something, but the only proof we have is a building that I was in when it burned down, some singed papers, and a forest that, from the way you described it, if we were to take other people into it, they would be eaten alive. I groaned in frustration, upset over how helpless I felt, lying in this stupid hospital bed. I know! You're right! You're right! But we have to do something! We might be the only people on the entire planet who know about this and are trying to stop it. But what do we do? A slow grin spread across Joe's face, the kind that tended to make me very nervous back in the good old days. It was a smile that said, I know you said we shouldn't slip past this police tape, Mary, but I just did, and look what I found. It was a smile that said he was about to do something dangerous. I missed that smile. It had been too long since I had last seen it. He held up the briefcase, pointing at it. We go after this Dr. Saul guy, whoever he is. He's the only name we have, but it's a clear connection. We find him, we get him to talk, and then we take it from there. Unless you have a better idea. I grimaced. I really wish I did, but I don't. But how do we even find this guy? We don't even know if it's his first or last name. But this, too, Joe had an answer for, as he reached into his briefcase and held up a phone book. You carry that around with you? I asked, slightly bemused. You never know. Besides, it's like I always say, start with the basics. When it comes to tracking people down, don't overcomplicate it. at least not until you need to. Want to find someone? Check the phone book. If they aren't in there, then that's when you might have an issue. He began to thumb through the pages, no doubt heading to the S section. This left me with a moment to myself, which I took advantage of to check my leg. It wasn't as bad as it could have been, thankfully, but the doctor had still told me that I should probably try to keep weight off of it for at least a couple of weeks. When he had asked me what had caused such a messy wound, I had floundered, unsure of how to explain it. My initial idea of saying it was a burglar seemed absurd for such an injury, so I finally settled on a wild dog attacking me and my cat. The doc seemed satisfied with that answer, though then they had insisted that I make sure that I had had a rabies shot, which I assured them I did. I didn't even want to think about what sort of diseases that monster might have been harboring in its mouth. But I didn't really like that thought, and thankfully a distraction presented itself in the form of Joe, who was now scrolling his finger down the appropriate page. Here we go. 2 Sauls, last names. One lives on 446 Kana Street, which is about a 4-hour drive from here, if my directions hold true, and they usually do. The other is on Bethel Street, house number 28, about an hour away. I say we go over there and give him a little visit. It was pretty forward for my tastes. Normally I would advise that we attempt to gather more evidence before we just go barging up to some random people's houses. But honestly, I had no other ideas. Alright, but not right now, obviously. We need to give my leg time to heal, and time to think about everything that has happened to us. I say that we give it about a week. Then, if we still have no other leads or ideas, we go visit these Sauls and see what they have to say. Joe nodded. Agreed. I think that I will go check on the women's shelter. Not go in, of course, but see if there's any suspicious characters hanging around outside of it. Oh, like yourself? I said teasingly, before actually thinking about what I had just said. I hadn't actually told a joke in what seemed to be forever, but it just slipped right out of my mouth. That was 2 in one day. It was a strange feeling that, despite all the horrors and nightmares of not only the past few nights but these last few months, I was able to say something so light-hearted. Maybe it was seeing an old friend again. Maybe it was the sunlight streaming through the windows. Whatever it was, I didn't hate it. It didn't mean the pain was gone, of course, but it just wasn't on the forefront of my mind anymore. I wanted to enjoy it, even with the ache in my leg and the knowledge that eventually, maybe even soon, we would probably run into those meat creatures again. Joe seemed surprised at my little joke, but then smiled. Hey, I don't count. I'm one of the good guys. He stood up, grabbing his briefcase, but then, after thinking about it for a second, putting it back down again. Here, you hold on to this. Feel free to go through the papers, see if there's anything we missed the first time around. Who knows? Maybe you'll find something. He started walking out of the room, but then stopped at the door, turning around to face me again. Mary, listen. I know it's been tough for you, and I'm sorry I haven't been there for you like I should have. But I want you to know that... He was interrupted by a woman's scream from outside, followed shortly by the sound of breaking glass. Wasting no time, he dashed out the door, leaving me alone in the hospital bed with nothing but the sound of the wind outside the window to keep me company. This silence did not last, however, as quickly more screams filled the air, along with other, harder-to-place sounds. Sounds of squishing, and wet noises that unfortunately sounded very familiar. I struggled to sit up straighter in bed to get a look out the door as footsteps ran by my room, a lot of them, very fast. More screams now, and I started to struggle to stand up, using the bed as support as I worked my way around it so I could get a look around. I cursed my leg in those awful woods where it got injured as agony shot through me, but I managed to make it to the door as I heard thumping, as if something heavy was dropped as the screams continued. Peeking out into the hallway, I saw panicked people running past me, away from something further down the hall, but what they were running from, I had no idea. A loud boom slammed into my ears, the unmistakable sound of a gun being fired from down the hall from where the people were running from, and I nearly stumbled from the shock of it. As I struggled to get my bearings, a man slammed into me and then I did fall, hitting the ground hard as I was overwhelmed from a cacophony of noise. I struggled to right myself, gripping the door frame, when a strong hand grabbed my arm and pulled me upwards, helping me stand. It was Joe, the seventh shot in his hand and fear in his eyes. What is it? I demanded, confused and frustrated. An attack of some kind? Joe pulled me into the room, leaving me to lean against the wall as he quickly grabbed the briefcase and my spare set of clothes. It's one of those things. The meat things. It's here, in the hospital. It's got He wavered here, and I could see that he was struggling for words. Like feelers, like a sea urchin or something, but not really. We gotta get out of here. I saw it grab a man and lift him up like he weighed nothing. I shot it, but it didn't even seem to notice. The bastard. He spit, grabbing my arm with one hand and the briefcase in the other, shoving my clothes into my hands. What? It's here? In the hospital? But it's the middle of the day. In a crowded building. In the middle of the city, I said, hardly believing what I was hearing as we stumbled out into the hallway. I know, he growled, helping to lead me toward a glowing exit sign as several other people streamed past, notably less than there had been just a moment ago. They must have gotten out already. Or maybe they didn't. I didn't really like that thought. We continued to walk down the hallway, Joe being forced to help me move as I cursed my leg once again. My breathing was heavy, and my head spun, trying to make sense of it all. Why were one of those things here? Was it targeting us, specifically? But why? Joe nearly dropped the gun as a deep, throaty noise came from behind us, followed by the slick sound of raw flesh being dragged across clean tile floors. I glanced backwards, but there was nothing but the empty hallway. All the other people had already fled. Well, those that could. I felt terrible for the elderly or infirm that were unable to move on their own, trapped in their rooms as they listened to the noises that approached. We finally reached a turn in the hallway, making the sharp right and nearly slamming into a gurney that had been left in the middle of the hall in all the panic. Where is the exit to this goddamn place? I huffed, feeling the frustration building in my chest. Thankfully, my question was shortly answered by a glowing red sign with that exact word on it, guiding the way out. We made our way to it, just a few feet away from the next turn when suddenly the power cut out, casting us into darkness and setting off a new round of screams from everyone else who was still inside. What now? Joe groaned beside me, his face barely visible in the sudden darkness. It shouldn't last long. It's a hospital. They have backup generators, I assured him, and indeed, an electric hum filled the air as the building came back to life. But now, only the emergency lights were on, putting everything into a perpetually gloomy state. The shadows ran deep now, despite what had been a sunny day outside, and I felt fear slowly coil its way into my heart, but I refused to let it control me. Come on, the exit is right there, I said, dragging Joe with me, the sparse lighting making him seem so much older. We froze, however, when we once again heard the sound of flesh being dragged, much closer this time. But more than that, it was the smell. Once again, that disparate smell filled my nose, the smell of chocolate and cookies and cake, delicious smells that made my mouth involuntarily water, despite me knowing the truth. I glanced at Joe and I could see the fear in his eyes as he smelled it too, knowing what it meant. Delicious. It reminds me of my mother, he whispered to me, and I nodded in agreement. The smell grew stronger, and we couldn't help but turn to look back down the hall and at the corner, where a grasping hand grabbed from behind the wall, back where we had just come from. A second hand followed, then a third, and a fourth, and then many more as it dragged itself around the corner. It was red and raw, like the others, but this one squirmed and thrashed on the ground like a worm that had just been stepped on and was flailing around in confusion and pain. It had no eyes to speak of, instead grabbing at everything around it with its many, many hands that stuck out of the top of it, just like Joe had said. There were maybe hundreds. I could somewhat see his comparison to a sea urchin, though to me it looked more like a worm crossed with a porcupine, if the porcupine's quills were human arms. It grasped at everything, leaving bloody handprints all over the walls, the floors, the gurney that we had so nearly run into just before. Even as we watched, it reached up and grabbed the light bulb next to it, shattering it and casting itself into even deeper darkness. But even with that darkness, I could see the way it moved, using its many limbs to drag itself down the hall as the main body thrashed, almost independent of the limbs that sprouted from its back. I could just barely make out behind it a tube that connected to its rear, stretching beyond the corridor back to where it came from. It was the same as the animals that had chased me, I noted. They always seemed to be connected back to something that felt like it was important. Not that I would necessarily get out of this place to do anything with that information. Joe shook me, and I realized that I had been standing still in shock, or probably fear, for far too long. He gestured with his head towards the exit and I nodded, both of us trying to make as little noise as possible. We didn't know if this thing was able to hear, but we didn't need to take any chances. We crept slowly, me now holding onto the briefcase and clothes as Joe held me on my weak side and gripped the seventh shot with his other hand, never taking his eyes off the thing behind us. It groaned, despite having no obvious mouth as it continued to work its way down the corridor, only occasionally stopping to stretch its limbs into the side rooms, getting uncomfortably close to us as we continued our agonizingly slow escape. "It's searching," Joe muttered under his breath, and I was surprised to see that he was right. It was almost methodical. Check room, move down, check room, move down. There was almost a rhythm to it. But why? So many questions, so impossible to answer. I hated it. A sudden shriek, and it seemed that the creature had found its prize. It lifted from a room a young girl, perhaps only 7, grasping her with several of its hands. She screamed again as it dragged her toward its main body, and I was moving before I even realized it, slamming the briefcase into several of its arms, causing it to gurgle in surprise and let go of her with them. It wasn't enough, however, as even as she tried to run, a limb still held onto her leg. A sudden boom, and suddenly there was a meaty hole in the arm grasping her as both me and the girl were dragged away by Joe, as the thing screamed in undeniable rage. "Come on!" he yelled, pulling the girl to her feet as she stumbled over her own legs. I ran after them, sparing a glance behind me to see the behemoth giving chase, gurgling and shrieking. Joe slammed through a door and I followed, blindly trusting him to know where we were going. He led us through, though, with us finally bursting out into the blessed sunlight as we ran through the front doors. I gasped for air as I watched the little girl squirm out of Joe's arms and go running to a man and woman who seemed to be just getting ready to head back inside, clearly looking for her. She sobbed into their arms as they comforted her, causing a strange mixture of emotions to arise in my chest. I was happy for them, of course, but still, as I watched this young girl and her parents, I couldn't help but feel jealous of what they had. As I looked at them, someone placed their hand on my shoulder, and I turned to see Joe, haggard but in one piece, asking me something that I didn't quite hear. "What was that?" I asked. "Are you doing all right? That was pretty intense back there, and I know that you were already..." For the second time today, Joe got cut off from his sentence as the doors to the hospital suddenly slammed open. Grasping red hands grabbed onto the double door frames as gurgling noises filled the air, causing a fresh round of shrieks to arise from all the people that had gathered in the parking lot. We could only watch in horror as the thing dragged itself out through the door, covering the frame in slime and something that could only be blood. Me and Joe stumbled backwards, trying to make distance as it grabbed blindly with its hands at the surrounding area. "The car," Joe said, and I nodded, having trouble taking my eyes off the thing as it pulled itself forward once more, almost completely out of the hospital now. It was bizarre, seeing it in broad daylight, the light causing the slime that was all over its body to glisten and making it easy to see every horrifying detail. Here, in the light, I could see that it had a mouth, no lips, only teeth, directly in the center of its back, which gave me the queasy realization that the people it had been grabbing had been almost certainly pulled into that maw. I turned and stumbled forward, making my way to Joe's beater, which I knew for a fact was more than a decade old, but right now it might as well have been a brand new gleaming race car. Joe rushed around to the driver's side and unlocked it, throwing himself in while I did much the same, tossing the briefcase into the back seat. I slammed the door shut behind me as I looked out the window, seeing the monstrosity was still near the front of the hospital, but for how much longer that would hold true was anyone's guess. Joe turned the key over and over, causing the engine to sputter and gasp as he cursed every swear word I had ever heard, and a couple I hadn't. As he struggled, I kept my eyes on the thing, and as I peered out, a car attempted to squeal past it, but before they could make any distance, it reached over with at least 50 hands and grabbed it, simply lifting it into the air like it was a children's toy. I watched in terror as the thing tore off the metal roof to the car and grabbed the man inside that had been driving. It lifted him towards its body, the arms holding on to him so hard they were leaving marks, the mouth on the back of the thing gnashing, and I wanted to tear my eyes away so I didn't have to watch this terrible display, but at the same time I simply needed to know. The thing stuffed the man into its mouth whole, and I could even see a glimpse of his panicked face as he was consumed by it, never standing a chance. I came to the terrible realization that it was a miracle we had saved that little girl. "Joe," I whispered, not taking my eyes off the thing as it dropped the car to the ground and started to feel around once more. "We need to go. Now." "What do you think I'm trying to do? Take a nap?" he yelled, turning the key over once more as the car made a strange noise before finally roaring to life. "Yes!" he yelled, but I did not share in his excitement, as I could see that all our noise had attracted the attention of the thing, and now it was rapidly squirming towards us, the hands reaching out desperately to try and grab the vehicle before it could even move. "Now! Go now! Now!" I screamed, and he slammed the gas, sending the car flying forward and just narrowly avoiding getting grabbed. We weren't out of the woods yet, though, as the thing was chasing after us, moving surprisingly fast for such a bizarre shape. Joe glanced in the rearview mirror, nearly losing control of the wheel when he saw how close we had been to getting caught by it. "Holy shit!" he screamed, and I was inclined to agree. It was keeping pace with us, only a few feet behind, and I knew there was a very real possibility that the car would give out, or Joe would be forced to slow down, or perhaps it would simply go a little faster. I watched as it inched closer and closer, nearly grabbing onto our bumper, and I said a silent goodbye to the world, knowing this was the end. A finger brushed the trunk of the car, and a tear rolled down my cheek as I thought of all the things that I had wanted to do, but now would never get the chance. The thing was suddenly yanked backwards, and it let out a shriek so terrible I thought my ears would bleed from the sheer volume of it. We sped away, far from its grasp, and I could see that it had reached the end of its rope, quite literally. The tube that stretched all the way back into the hospital, the thing that seemed to run out of the back of all these horrible beasts, had reached its limit and had brought the creature to a crashing halt. It grasped at us as we sped away, but there was nothing it could do about it. We were free.